Hello and welcome to this sample lecture in philosophy. My name is Pablo, I'm a postgraduate student here at the University of Cambridge, and in the next 20 minutes I will be talking to you about a topic in philosophy. In particular, I will be talking to you about political philosophy. I hope that by doing so I can give you some idea of how it is to study philosophy at Cambridge and whether or not you might be interested in this topic. In particular, I will be speaking about ancient philosophy, so I will be speaking about the political writings of Plato and Aristotle. And I will be using material that I've actually encountered in lectures here at Cambridge, so I hope it can give you some idea. Without further ado, let's get right into it. So what is political philosophy? Political philosophy is the study of key political concepts, such as justice, legitimacy, freedom, or democracy. Hence, political philosophers ask questions like, what is the nature of justice? Or what is a just state? Or what is a just state given the systems of democracy and economical systems we have now? Other questions might be, what is legitimacy? When is a state legitimate? When is a state policy legitimate? Or when is it the case that we actually ought to resist a certain policy imposed by the state? Similar questions can be asked about freedom as well. So, what is freedom? Obviously, the first question. Is there a difference between freedom and liberty? Where does freedom stop? Where does my freedom stop in order to protect the freedom of others? These questions too are belabored by political philosophers. Now, to give an example how political philosophy might connect to your personal life, why should we be interested in the study of those concepts? Well, I think political philosophy is really closely connected to our ordinary lives, and I think we encounter questions of political philosophy on many occasions in our everyday life. To give a recent example, are the policies imposed by governments, for instance the UK government, against coronavirus, are these policies legitimate? Is it legitimate to restrict the freedom of individual citizens as much as done by the UK or other governments? This question obviously depends on what we mean by freedom and legitimacy. And it depends on our idea of how far the state's power should be able to go. Now let's say you think that it is legitimate, that freedom of citizens is restricted by measures against coronavirus. Why is it legitimate? Where does this legitimacy derive from? Does it derive from a democratic value in the idea that these measures are legitimate because we, as the population, as the people, we gave power to decide to certain representative politicians, and those politicians decided to take on certain measures. And hence there is a chain of legitimacy from the voters to the measures. Or is it rather that the legitimacy of this policy is not derived from this democratic chain, instead it is derived from some kind of ethical principle, for instance the utilitarian maxim, to do that which maximizes utility for all. So in this example, or these questions, I think they show very nicely how political philosophy is located within the broader structure of humanities and philosophy in particular. For instance, on the one hand, we see that political science is relevant to political philosophy. So how people think, how voters think, how our political systems actually work is something that has consequences for how we think about the concept of democracy, justice, and freedom. On the other hand, we have political philosophy which is connected to ethics, which I tried to show by the relation between the measures against coronavirus and utilitarianism, right? So there the idea is that political philosophy, or sometimes people think of political philosophy as applied ethics, in the sense that you have some kind of ethical principle, and then you institute this ethical principle in a political system or in a political activism. So political philosophy is somehow in between the more empirically minded studies of political science and the more abstract, morally minded studies of ethics. Now, I want to show you this in-betweenness of political philosophy, which is also one of the reasons which makes it so interesting, in my views, with one specific example. And this example is the question of what is a just state. Now this question, what is a just state, has a central place in political philosophy. And many philosophers have thought about it and written about it and spilled a great deal of ink on this question. Now I would like to trace this question in ancient philosophy, so in the works of Plato and Aristotle, and this is really where this question first arises. So in order to briefly sketch the very long history of the question of what a just state is, we need to travel 2,500 years back in time into Athens of the classical era, and we need to look at this one philosopher called Plato. Now Plato wrote one of the key texts of political philosophy called the Republic, Plato's Republic. And in this dialogue he lets a fictional character called Socrates talk with some of his friends, some strangers and fellow citizens that Socrates meets, and they talk about the true nature of justice. They ask, what is justice? And this text became so influential in political philosophy because one of the strategies that Socrates, this fictional Socrates, employs is that he asks, well, if we want to know what justice is, we might want to imagine how a just city or a just state might look like. And if we understand what a just state looks like, we might understand something about the nature of justice more generally. Now, what I want to do next is I want to actually go through a couple of passages from the Republic Review, and I want to read them out to you. And I want to do this because I think it is interesting for you to see how an actual Platonic dialogue reads, how this key text in philosophy reads, how the arguments are developed, and how it is to read such a text, because this will be one of the things which you will be doing a lot if you choose to study philosophy. And before I do that, I just want to say one thing. So, perhaps some of you have heard of Socrates as an actual historical figure and as the teacher of Plato. And that's true. There was a person called Socrates who was a philosopher who was sentenced to death by the Athenians. And he had a couple of pupils and people that listened to him, and one of them was Plato. But the thing is that Plato wrote all his books, or most of his books were figuring a person called Socrates, who was the main character in his books and who was developing the main arguments. So Plato used a fictional version of Socrates in order to develop his own views, and he would always kind of let Socrates speak for what he thought was correct. And there is a debate in scholarship whether or not the actual historical Socrates can be identified with the fictional Socrates that Plato creates in his dialogues. Just this as a cautionary tale, because if we read now a couple of pages of the Republic, then I will always talk about Socrates who is speaking. But you must bear in mind that this is a fictional figure created by Plato and who expresses Plato's views. So let's get right into it. The thing is that, let's get right into it. So Socrates says the following: if we could watch a city coming to be, in theory, wouldn't we also see its justice coming to be and its injustice as well? This is he asks, and he asks this question to his interlocutor, and at this place in the dialogue, this interlocutor is a person called Adeimantus. So Adeimantus is always responding to Socrates, and he says, probably so. Socrates then asks again, and when this process of imagining a city in theory is completed, we can hope to find what we are looking for more easily, namely the nature of justice. Of course, says Adeimantus. Now Socrates says, I think a city comes to be because none of us is self-sufficient, but we all need many things. Do you think that a city is founded on any other principle? Adeimantus says, no. Socrates then goes on and says, and because people need many things, and because one person calls on a second out of one need, and on a third out of a different need, many people gather in a single place to live together as partners and helpers. Sorry. And such a settlement is called a city. Isn't that so? Yes. And if they share things with one another, giving and taking, they do so because each believes that this is better for himself. Alemonte says that's right. Just a quick note. So this is the key idea in Adam Smith, right? So one of the ideas in Adam Smith is that, who was one of the, who founded the discipline of economics, was that people do things out of self-interest, which have benefits for everyone. So the butcher and the baker give to each other the things they need, bread and meat, not because they want to be altruistic or nice to each other, but instead out of self-interest. So Smith has a crucial idea that capitalism and our economies work because people do things that are beneficial for everyone out of self-interest. Just a quick note, this is already present here in Plato. But let's go back to the text. Socrates then continues, he says, "Come then, let's create the city in theory from its beginnings. And it's our needs, it seems, that will create it." So Socrates says, we have needs as humans, and out of these needs arises a city. And now he wants to build this city in theory with us. So he says, surely our first and greatest need is to provide food to sustain life. Our second is for shelter, and our third for clothes, and so on. That's right, says Alemonte. Socrates then asks, how then will a city be able to provide all this? Won't one person have to be a farmer, another a builder, and another a weaver? And shouldn't we add a cobbler and someone else to provide medical care? All right, says Alemonte. So, Socrates concludes, the essential minimum for a city is 4 or 5 men. So you have a farmer, provides food, you have a builder, provides houses, you have a weaver, provides clothes, you have a cobbler, providing metallurgy, and you have some doctor providing medical care. Socrates then goes on to ask, what about this? Must each of those 4 or 5 citizens contribute his own work for the common use of all? For example, will the farmer provide food for everyone, spending quadruple the time and labor to provide food to be shared by them all? Or will he not bother about that, producing 1/4 the food in 1/4 the time and spending the other 3/4, one in building a house, one in the production of clothes, and one in making shoes, not troubling to associate with the others, but minding his own business? So Socrates here asks, what is better? Is it better if these 5 citizens have division of labor and specialization? Also a thought from the beginning of economics from Adam Smith. Is it better if these 5 people specialize in one business each? Or is it better if each of them is somewhat in autarky and all of them provide their own food and clothes and products? Now Alemonte says, perhaps Socrates, the way you suggested first, so the division of labor, would be easier than the other. That certainly wouldn't be surprising, for even as you were speaking it occurred to me that in the first place we aren't all born alike, but each of us differs somewhat in nature from the others, one being suited to one task, another to another. So here Plato suggests a parallel, right? He suggests a parallel between having a division of labor, which is more efficient than if each individual produces all products they need by themselves. But this division of labor parallels somewhat the fact that we aren't all born alike. Instead, each of us has their individual talents and preferences and character. Hence, the diversity between people is somehow matched to a principle of division of labor which generates more efficiency. And the very important notion that Plato introduces here is the idea that each citizen does the task which suits their own. Now, as the dialogue goes on, Socrates and his interlocutors contemplate how which other occupations are needed for a city to sustain themselves. And they realize that they need traders, they need military, they need many different things, right? And so the city grows and grows, but still the principle is that each citizen does that to which they're suited best. Good. So this is a really important thought, because Plato thinks that a state will be just if this is the case. A state will be just if each citizen is doing that job for which they are suited best. This is kind of the nature of justice. The person best suited for farming will do farming. The person best suited for forging will become a locksmith. The person best suited to become a fisher will become a fisherman or a fisherwoman, and so on. Now, Plato also thinks, as we just saw in this passage, that the products of each of these occupations, the actual goods produced, should be shared by all, right? So the farmer should work quadruple the time to provide for his other fellow citizens. And so should the house builder build not only his own house, but also build the house for others. And the weaver not only his own clothes, but also weave the clothes for others. Hence, one could think that Plato is kind of advancing a proto-communist idea that where there's no private property and all property is shared, and all labor is contributing to the same pool of common goods. So this is really the sum of the ideal state in Plato's sense. Now, at this point, you may ask, that sounds all well, that sounds all jolly nice. But who is to say which occupation that I am best suited for? So who has the authority to allocate occupations and tell me you will become a farmer, and tell you will become a fisherman, and tell a third that they will become a weaver? Who has this authority? In a similar spirit, you may wonder, if we are living in a city together, inevitably there will be some point where certain decisions on behalf of the community must be made. For instance, there might be a war with another city, or there might be some investments needed to provide for communal goods, such as infrastructure or schools. Who gets to decide on these things? Now, because Plato thinks that each citizen should engage in that occupation for which they're best suited, the question we've just asked is essentially the question, who is best suited to become a politician? Who is best suited to take on responsibility and carry out decisions on behalf of the community? And to this, Plato has an infamous answer. He thinks the people best suited to become politicians and to become powerful in this ideal state are philosophers. So, in his ideal state, the citizenry is divided into three classes. They are the helpers, they are the auxiliaries, and they are the guardians. And while the first two, the helpers and the auxiliaries, are engaged in kind of this business we've just talked about, so weaving, farming, building houses, etc., the last class, the guardians, are really the philosophers who take care of education and statesmanship. Plato is really clear on this, and he really thinks that the kings and queens of our cities ought to be philosophers. And he puts it like this: unless philosophers become kings in the cities, or those whom we now call kings and rulers philosophize truly and adequately, and there is a conjunction of political power and philosophy, there can be no succession of evils for cities, nor, I think, for the human race. So this is how Plato thinks that political power ought to be allocated in the ideal state. It should be given to the philosophers. Why does he think that? So Plato has two arguments for this, and both are very controversial. First, he says, philosophers are not interested in power. Philosophers love wisdom and nothing else. Power doesn't mean anything to them. Hence, they will not get corrupted. Okay, you may think that sounds all good and well. His second argument is that philosophers are well equipped to become rulers because they spend so much time searching for wisdom. They actually are more likely to discover truth about what is actually good for the city. So now I would like you to ask yourself what you think of this argument. Do you think it's true that in the ideal state, the queens and kings, the rulers, would be philosophers? Do you think it's true that philosophers are less likely to be corrupted by power? And also, I really want you to ask yourself, is it just if a philosopher could come and tell you which occupation you ought to do now for the rest of your life, and which occupation you are best suited for, without that you actually have some share in determining which occupation that would be? Now, this has been raised against Plato many times. He has been called authoritarian exactly for that reason, right? But on the other hand, I also want you to think, why did Plato come up with such a solution? Why did he envisage a society where all political power is allocated to one specific class of people as the just state? Is it just because he was living in a very different time, having really weird ideas, or is there something true to it? So, for instance, you might ask, well, it seems right that politicians should be non-corrupted and truth-seeking, right? So these two reasons why Plato thinks that philosophers are especially good politicians arguably actually would make a good politician. So then you can ask, what can we learn from Plato about how to foster such virtues in our education in order for our politicians to become less corrupted and more truth-seeking? So this might be trying to see the positive side, or maybe also the relevant side of Plato's argument for today. Now, with these questions, which I thoroughly encourage you to take a moment and think about them and try to figure out if you have an opinion on them, because that's really an important thing in philosophy. Think about what people from long ago or from less long ago thought and then forming an opinion about it. So I really encourage you to take your time and think about these questions. But now, in the last part of this lecture, I also want to go to a different Greek philosopher, namely Aristotle. Aristotle was living a bit later than Plato, and there is a common view that while Plato was kind of idealistically minded, Aristotle was more realistically minded. This is very nicely exemplified in Raphael's painting, The School of Athens, in the Stanze in Rome. On this famous painting, you see that Plato is depicted as pointing to the sky, and Aristotle is depicted as pointing to the ground, indicating this view that Plato is more concerned with ideal notions of things, where Aristotle is more concerned with empirical and real results. Now, this distinction is a very broad and, of course, great distinction, and as many things in philosophy, it is hotly debated whether this is true. So there are many scholars who point out how realistically minded Plato was at times, and there are other scholars who point out how ideally minded Aristotle was at other times. Yet, for the purpose of this sample lecture, I want to stick with this very broad distinction, and I want to highlight how this distinction plays out in the concept of their political writings. Now, in Aristotle's writings on politics, he emphasizes the importance of history and of actually existing political systems for our theorizing about politics. For instance, he talks in detail about the political systems of the Spartans, the Athenians, and the Persians, in order for us to understand more about how political systems actually developed, such that this might inform our theorizing about the political. Now, Aristotle's writings on politics can, in some parts, be understood as a critique of Plato's Republic. And I want to just, as a closing section of this sample lesson, I want to look at one criticism that Aristotle raises against Plato. So, Plato's ideal of a community where everything is shared presupposes that the individual citizens feel a great deal of connectedness among each other. Plato thought that in order for the farmer and the weaver to give away the products of their labor to the other citizens, they need to feel connected in a deep sense with them. And he thought that the only way to achieve such a sense of connectedness is what Plato calls the noble lie. This noble lie consists in the idea that the guardians should deceive the citizens into believing that all of them are related as brothers and sisters. And this is a point which is criticized by Aristotle. Aristotle thinks that this noble lie, which Plato thought was justified because it increases the sense of unity in the state, is going too far. Aristotle's basic conviction is the following. A city is necessarily a composition of plurality of voices and perspectives. Now, Plato's proposal to share common property and to have this noble lie that everyone was related among each other as members of the family would, in Aristotle's view, reduce this plurality. And here's a really nice passage from Aristotle's Politics where he makes this point. I quote, "There is a point at which a state may attain such a degree of unity as to no longer be a state, or at which, without actually ceasing to exist, it will become an inferior state, like harmony passing into unison, or rhythm which has been reduced to a single note. The state is a plurality which should be unified and made into a community by education." So I think this is a really nice passage because Aristotle criticizes Plato for having as his ideal city really a unity, a community which is so unified that every sense of plurality in some sense is lost. And Aristotle thinks of this as a loss because he thinks of the city as essentially a plurality which is unified in education. But first and foremost, the city is a plurality, and we shouldn't try to reduce it to a unity. Otherwise, we will incur a loss. Like we would incur a loss if we would reduce the rich, aesthetic pleasure of hearing a chord to a single note, or even to the same note played at different heights. Right? If you play 3 times the same note, just each of them an octave away from each other, it never has the same character as if you play a real chord, like C major. So this is a point of criticism that Aristotle launches against Plato, very fundamental criticism. Because it's about the metaphysics of what a city really is and what it should be. It should not be a unity, in Aristotle's sense, but a plurality. Now, this is a very abstract argument, you may think. And that's true, that's a very abstract argument. And the question thus arises, how does this play out in a more applied context? And Aristotle gives us one example of this. So, we saw before that in Plato's ideal state, property is shared. There's no private property. Instead, all goods which are produced by the individual citizens is shared with all citizens. Now, Aristotle thinks that that's a bad idea. He argues the following, I quote, "That which is common to the greatest number has the least care bestowed upon it. Everyone thinks chiefly of his own, hardly at all of the common interest." So again, we have this difference between a more idealistically minded Plato and a more worldly minded Aristotle. Because Aristotle is highlighting a contingent feature of our psychology, namely that we value that which is our own more than that which is common. That would be known in economics as the tragedy of the commons, or something similar would be known like that. And Aristotle takes this feature of our psychology in order to make an argument against the idea that common and there should be no private property. So Aristotle thinks that property should be private in order to ensure that people take care of it. But there should be a right of use for those who are in need. So there should be private property, but it should not be the case that any citizen is at want of subsistence. And in order to prohibit this, he thinks that everyone should be allowed to use property, even if it's owned by someone else. Now, this is just an example of how this very abstract argument of the city being essentially plurality plays out in a more applied case, namely the question of how property should be allocated. Now, with this, I end my lecture on Plato and Aristotle. I hope I could give you some flavor of how studying philosophy might be like, of the texts you might encounter, and of the ideas that you might have if you listen to a lecture in philosophy. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you could take something with you from this lecture. Thank you. Goodbye.